All right, Donald Trump thought he had seen every legal twist before. Every challenge, every courtroom battle, every headline storm. But just moments ago, an unexpected court move changed the tone completely. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a decision that quietly raised the stakes in a way few saw coming. Because this isn't the kind of move that grabs attention instantly, it's the kind that reshapes everything behind the scenes. The kind lawyers read twice, the kind that forces teams into emergency strategy sessions, the kind that signals something bigger may be unfolding. What makes this moment different isn't just the ruling itself. It's what it suggests. A shift, a tightening, a signal that the margin for error is disappearing. And when you understand what the court did and what it could lead to next, you'll see why this case may have just entered its most critical phase yet. Because here's what you need to understand before we go any further. This isn't just another headline. This isn't just another twist in the endless cycle of Trump legal drama that's been playing out for years. This is different. The kind of different that makes veteran attorneys stop mid-sentence and rethink everything they thought they knew about where this is headed. One unexpected court move, and suddenly the stakes aren't just high, they're stratospheric, and the clock is ticking in a way it never has before. So what actually happened? Why are legal insiders whispering about this like it changes everything? And more importantly, what does it mean for the man who built an entire identity around being untouchable? Stay with me. Because by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to understand why people who've spent their entire careers in courtrooms are saying they've never seen anything quite like this. Let's start with where things stood before this moment. Because context matters. You can't understand how explosive this development is without understanding how carefully constructed the legal landscape had become. For the better part of 3 years, Trump's legal team had been operating on a strategy built around delay, deflection, and the calendar. Delay the proceedings long enough, stretch every deadline, challenge every ruling, file every possible motion until the legal machinery grinding against you gets overwhelmed by its own complexity. It was working, partially. Cases that should have moved quickly were crawling. Timelines that prosecutors mapped out were getting shredded by appeals, by procedural fights, by arguments that seemed designed not to win, but simply to consume time like a legal black hole. And then the court moved in a direction nobody predicted. The filing came in early, before most of the courthouse regulars had even settled into their routines. A procedural document on its surface. The kind of thing that gets filed dozens of times a day in courts across America and generates exactly zero attention. But buried inside the language, wrapped in the dry, technical vocabulary that turns most people's eyes glassy, was a mechanism that legal scholars are now calling breathtaking in its implications. The court wasn't just ruling on a motion. It was redefining the scope of what this case can reach. And when Trump's legal team read it, multiple sources say the reaction inside those offices wasn't measured legal analysis. It was alarm. Here's why. For months, the defense strategy had depended on walls. Compartmentalization. Keep this case separate from that case. Argue that evidence gathered here can't travel there. Build legal firewalls between the different fronts of litigation so that even if one case got worse, it couldn't contaminate the others. It was smart architecture for someone fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. And for a while, it held. This court move just punched a hole in the wall. Not a crack, a hole. And what can flow through it threatens to reshape the entire legal picture in ways that Trump's team is scrambling to address in real time. Let me be specific about why this matters. Because the details here are where the real story lives. The unexpected move involved a judicial determination regarding the scope of permissible evidence in the proceedings. Essentially, the court has signaled a willingness to consider a broader evidentiary framework than the defense had been counting on. In plain language, evidence that Trump's lawyers thought was safely cordoned off, documents from separate investigations, financial records from entities they believed were shielded by different legal proceedings, testimony that had been walled off by earlier procedural rulings, all of it is now potentially in play. One former federal prosecutor who reviewed the filing spent several minutes in silence before responding to questions about it. Then he said something that stuck. He said, "The defense built their house on sand and convinced themselves it was concrete. This just showed them the difference." That's not hyperbole. That's someone who's seen hundreds of these cases telling you that the foundational assumption of Trump's legal strategy just got challenged in a way they didn't anticipate and may not be able to recover from quickly enough. But let's slow down here, because there are people watching this who will say, and aren't entirely wrong to say, that we've heard this kind of thing before. Every few months, some new development gets described as a game changer. Every few weeks, some new filing gets characterized as a moment that changes everything. And yet here we are, years into this, and the story keeps going, keeps grinding, keeps producing headlines without producing final resolutions. That's a fair observation, and it deserves a serious answer. What makes this different isn't just the content of the court's move, it's the timing. It's the combination of timing and trajectory that separates this from the noise. Because the legal ecosystem around Trump right now isn't the same as it was a year ago. The walls that we're holding have been gradually eroding. Cases that seem distant have been converging. And this court move happened at precisely the moment when that convergence was approaching a critical point. Imagine you've been watching a slow avalanche for months. You see the snow shifting, you see the ground moving. Individually, each movement looks survivable, manageable. But there comes a moment when the accumulated momentum reaches a threshold, and what was slow becomes sudden. Legal experts are telling us, quietly but clearly, that this court move might be that threshold moment. And here's where the story gets darker for the Trump camp. The timing wasn't random. Courts don't make procedural moves in a vacuum. Every filing, every ruling, every judicial determination is the product of deliberation, of calculation. And the calculation that produced this move suggests something significant about how the judiciary is now viewing the overall posture of the defense. When a court expands the evidentiary scope in a case like this, it is sending a message, not explicitly, not in language you'd see quoted in the news, but in the unmistakable logic of what they've decided and what they've decided to allow. The message is this: we've watched the delay strategy. We've processed the procedural challenges. We've considered the arguments about compartmentalization and firewalls and the separation of different legal proceedings. And we've decided that justice in this case requires us to look at the whole picture. That's a devastating signal for a defense strategy built on keeping the picture fragmented. Sources close to the proceedings say Trump's legal team held an emergency session within hours of the filing becoming public. Multiple attorneys flew in, documents were pulled, strategy sessions that were supposed to be routine became something considerably more urgent. One person familiar with the internal atmosphere described it as controlled panic. The controlled part is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that description, because here's what they're dealing with. The evidentiary expansion the court has signaled could potentially bring into view documents and testimony that prosecutors have been wanting to use for months. Financial records from the Trump Organization that had been argued as out of scope. Communications between executives that the defense had successfully kept at arm's length, a paper trail that, if admitted and presented coherently, tells a story the defense absolutely does not want told. We've seen pieces of that story before. The financial statements that contradicted each other depending on who was reading them. The property valuations that swelled when loans were needed and shrank when taxes were calculated. The accountants who eventually walked away and said their work shouldn't be relied upon. Those pieces were already damaging. But they were pieces. What this court move potentially enables is the assembly of the whole picture, the complete narrative. The pattern, documented and presented not as isolated incidents, but as a continuous, deliberate course of conduct, stretching across years and encompassing entity after entity. That's a different beast than what we've seen in court proceedings so far. And here's something that isn't getting enough attention in the coverage I've seen. The independent monitor already overseeing Trump Organization operations isn't just a passive observer. They've been collecting information, reviewing financial decisions, building institutional knowledge about how the organization actually operates, not how it presents itself on financial statements, but how it actually moves money, structures deals, and makes decisions. That information exists. It's been accumulating. And if this court's evidentiary expansion extends to what the monitor has observed and documented, the implications are significant in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. One legal analyst with experience in complex financial fraud cases was direct about this. She said the monitor has essentially been building an evidence repository while appearing to simply perform oversight. If the court opens the door to that material, the prosecution has access to a level of granular insider documentation that money can't buy and time can't produce, because it comes from inside the operation itself. Now, let's talk about Trump's response, because this is where the story takes another turn that you need to understand. Within hours of the court move becoming known, Trump was on his social media platform, attacking, calling it unconstitutional overreach, accusing the judiciary of coordinating with his political enemies, using language that made his attorneys, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable. Language that legal professionals watching from the outside described as both legally counterproductive and psychologically revealing. Here's what I mean by psychologically revealing. There's a pattern that people who've watched this closely have noticed over the course of years. When Trump is genuinely confident about a legal outcome, his attacks are performative. They're loud and they're theatrical, but they have a certain energy to them, the energy of a man putting on a show for an audience. When Trump is genuinely worried, the attacks become personal, specific, bitter in a way that sounds less like strategy and more like fear expressing itself through aggression. The attacks that followed this court move had the second quality. Multiple people who know Trump personally and have observed him across years of legal and business battles noticed it. One former associate, speaking anonymously, put it simply, "I've seen him scared before." That's what scared sounds like. His legal team issued formal statements that were more measured, more legally calibrated. But the statements and the social media posts were in direct tension with each other in a way that creates its own complications. Because when a defendant is publicly attacking the proceedings while his lawyers are trying to engage those same proceedings professionally, it creates a credibility problem that is very difficult to manage. Judges notice, clerks notice, the entire ecosystem of the legal process notices when a defendant treats the court's authority with contempt in one forum while seeking the court's favor in another. And this particular court has already demonstrated that it notices such things and responds accordingly. Here's the part of this story that I keep coming back to. The part that feels like the real center of gravity underneath all the legal complexity and political noise. For decades, Donald Trump operated on a theory. The theory was that reputation, combined with legal resources, combined with the sheer exhausting complexity of fighting him in court, amounted to a kind of practical immunity, not legal immunity. Not the theoretical kind that lawyers argue about in briefs. Practical immunity. The immunity that comes from being too expensive to fight, too famous to challenge, too connected to hold accountable. He'd tested this theory hundreds of times across his career, in business disputes, in regulatory proceedings, in civil suits that settled quietly, in situations that should have produced consequences and instead produced nothing except the continued accumulation of power and wealth. The theory was largely correct for a very long time, and it shaped how he thought about risk, about accountability, about the relationship between someone like him and something like the law. What we're watching now in this courthouse and in these proceedings is what happens when that theory meets a system that has decided, for whatever mix of legal, political, and institutional reasons, not to let it work. Not this time, not anymore. That collision is the real story. Everything else, the specific rulings, the evidentiary determinations, the procedural maneuvers, all of it is just the visible surface of that deeper collision. A man who built his entire approach to the world on a theory of practical immunity, encountering a system that has decided to test whether the theory holds. And this unexpected court move is evidence, significant evidence, that the theory is failing. The financial implications of where this case is heading have not been adequately reported. Let me try to address that. Trump's empire, the real one beneath the branded surface, runs on leverage. Not just financial leverage, though there's plenty of that. Reputational leverage, the leverage that comes from being the Trump Organization. From having a name that commands premium pricing, attracts investors, and enables deals that wouldn't otherwise be possible. That leverage is a form of capital, intangible but real, and it has been gradually eroding as the legal troubles have accumulated. This court move accelerates that erosion. Here's why. When a court expands the evidentiary scope in a proceeding involving a major business entity, sophisticated financial actors notice. Banks that had already been distancing themselves from Trump Organization business will distance themselves further. Insurance companies that were already cautious will become more cautious still. Potential business partners who were on the fence about association will quietly move to the other side of that fence. None of this shows up in the immediate news cycle. It doesn't produce a headline, but it produces consequences that are potentially more lasting than any single ruling. Because the reputational and financial ecosystem that supports a business like the Trump Organization depends on confidence. Confidence that the entity is stable, that its leadership is sound, that association with it doesn't carry unacceptable risk. Every development that undermines that confidence removes a brick from a foundation that is already showing significant cracks. Multiple financial professionals who work in the New York real estate market, speaking off the record, used remarkably similar language when asked about the Trump Organization's current position. One phrase kept coming up: damaged goods, not worthless. Not destroyed, but damaged, in ways that are proving increasingly difficult to repair. And here's the thing about damaged goods in high-stakes real estate. The premium disappears fast. The Trump name once commanded prices above market. It enabled deals that comparable properties couldn't access. But as a whole, and a whole picture, when the evidence is as extensive as what's been accumulated, is a fundamentally different thing than the fragments. That's what has Trump's team genuinely alarmed. Not this single filing, not this single ruling, the possibility of the whole picture. There's a human dimension to this that tends to get lost in the legal analysis, and I don't want to lose it. The people who work in Trump properties, the maintenance workers, the doormen, the back office staff who've built careers and lives around these organizations, they're watching this unfold with a kind of helpless dread when court supervision gets expanded, when evidentiary scopes get broadened, when the foundational structures of an organization come under intensified scrutiny. The people at the bottom of the organizational chart are the most vulnerable. They didn't make the decisions that created this situation. They had no visibility into the financial manipulations, the inflated valuations, the fraudulent statements. They just showed up and did their jobs and built their lives around the assumption that the organization they worked for was stable. That assumption is now genuinely in question. And the cost of its failure, if it fails, will fall disproportionately on the people who had the least to do with creating the problem. That's always how it works. That's the part of these stories that deserves more attention and usually gets less. Here's what's keeping people in this story up at night. Not just Trump's legal team, not just the prosecutors, people who care about institutions, about the health of the legal system, about what all of this means for where we are as a country. When the most prominent political figure in America is simultaneously battling multiple serious legal proceedings while running for the nation's highest office, and when a significant portion of the population has been convinced that the legal proceedings themselves are illegitimate, weaponized, politically motivated attacks rather than the operation of law, something is being strained in the civic fabric that doesn't repair easily. This court move, unexpected and significant as it is in purely legal terms, exists inside that larger tension. It will be characterized by Trump's supporters as more evidence of a corrupt system conspiring against him. It will be characterized by his opponents as the inevitable consequence of documented wrongdoing finally catching up to someone who spent decades evading it. Both characterizations will be delivered with total conviction. Both will probably be believed completely by the people predisposed to believe them. And somewhere in the middle of that polarized noise, actual judges will make actual rulings based on actual evidence and actual law. The legal process will continue grinding. And the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, will be accepted as legitimate by some Americans and rejected as corrupt by others, regardless of what the evidence shows. That's the real crisis that this story is part of, not the legal fate of one man, consequential as that is, but the question of whether the institutions that are supposed to adjudicate disputes and enforce accountability can still command sufficient legitimacy to actually function. When one side views every adverse ruling as persecution, and the other views every favorable ruling as vindication, the system isn't really working the way it's supposed to work. It's functioning mechanically, but losing the social trust that makes its function meaningful. This unexpected court move is going to deepen that divide. That's certain. Before the legal implications fully play out, the political and cultural implications are already in motion. So where does this leave us right now? Right this moment? With the filing made and the implications spreading? It leaves us at a genuine inflection point. One of those rare moments in a long, complicated story where the next chapter is genuinely unpredictable, where the outcome hasn't been decided yet by the accumulated momentum of what came before, where decisions being made in courtrooms and legal offices and campaign war rooms over the next days and weeks will actually matter, will actually shape what comes next in ways that feel real and consequential. Trump's legal team is working around the clock on their response strategy. Prosecutors are preparing to move on the opening this court move has created. The independent monitor is continuing to accumulate documentation inside the Trump organization. Appeals courts are working through their timelines. And somewhere in all of that machinery, something is building toward a moment that none of us have seen yet. What I know from years of watching stories like this is that the moments that seem most explosive from the outside rarely produce the actual breaking point. The actual breaking point tends to come from something smaller, something procedural, something that doesn't even make the front page until suddenly everyone realizes what it meant. A filing nobody watched closely enough, a ruling buried in technical language, a decision that seemed routine until it wasn't. This unexpected court move might be that thing, or it might be the last visible event before that thing. Either way, something is moving toward resolution at a speed that the delay strategy was supposed to prevent. And the people who built that delay strategy are looking at each other right now and running out of answers. The most famous name in American real estate, the most recognizable brand in political life, the man who spent 40 years convincing the world he was untouchable, facing a legal system that has decided in the most methodical and documented way imaginable to test whether that's actually true. The answer is coming. Faster now than anyone planned. And when it arrives, it won't just tell us something about Donald Trump. It'll tell us something about what accountability in America actually means. Whether it applies to everyone or only to those without the resources to avoid it indefinitely. Whether institutions can hold under the pressure of someone willing to attack them without limit. Whether the line between law and politics has been crossed so many times in both directions that nobody can find it anymore. That's what's really at stake in this courtroom. That's what this unexpected court move just pushed closer to a verdict. And one way or another, the verdict is coming. The question isn't whether it arrives. The question is what it says when it does, and whether anyone will be willing to hear it. The latest courtroom twist has once again pushed the stakes to a critical point, leaving both supporters and critics watching closely as the situation continues to unfold. What makes this moment particularly significant isn't just the decision itself, but the timing and the ripple effect it could trigger across the broader legal landscape. Sudden moves like this often signal deeper shifts behind the scenes, strategic recalculations, new evidence coming into play, or pressure building from multiple directions. For Trump's legal team, this development adds a new layer of urgency. Every filing, every response, and every public statement now carries heightened weight. The margin for error is shrinking, and the path forward is becoming increasingly complex. Legal analysts suggest that unexpected court actions like this can reshape the trajectory of a case almost overnight, forcing both sides to adapt in real time. At the same time, the political implications cannot be ignored. High-profile cases like this rarely stay confined to the courtroom. Public perception, media narratives, and political strategy all intertwine, amplifying the impact of each new development. This latest move is likely to fuel further debate, energize supporters, and intensify scrutiny from opponents. What happens next could be pivotal. Will this decision open the door to more aggressive legal challenges? Could it accelerate timelines or introduce new legal risks? Or might it ultimately strengthen one side's position in ways that aren't immediately obvious? These are the questions now dominating the conversation. One thing is certain, the case has entered a more volatile phase. The unpredictability of the situation means that each new update could carry significant consequences. Observers are now on high alert, knowing that even a single ruling or filing could dramatically alter the course of events. As the dust settles from this latest development, all eyes remain firmly fixed on what comes next. In a case already defined by dramatic turns, this unexpected court move serves as a powerful reminder that the story is far from over, and that the most consequential moments may still be ahead. As legal teams regroup and reassess their next steps, the pressure continues to mount with each passing hour. Behind closed doors, strategies are being rewritten, and every possibility is being carefully weighed. The coming days could bring rapid developments, unexpected filings, or even more surprising decisions that shift momentum yet again. For now, the uncertainty keeps everyone guessing, but one thing remains clear. This case is moving toward a defining moment. Whether it leads to a breakthrough or deeper complications, the next chapter promises to be just as intense and potentially even more consequential than anything we've seen so far.